The sun dipped low on the horizon, painting the dusty main street of Prosperity, Colorado, with hues of amber and gold as Josephine Adler stepped onto her porch, the whispers that followed her through town still echoing in her ears. At 34, the widow of 2 years had learned to steel herself against the townspeople's pitying glances and not so subtle remarks about her fading bloom and barren future. Today had been particularly cruel, with Mrs. Whitaker loudly proclaiming at the general store that Josephine was too old to bear love again, let alone children, as if she weren't standing mere feet away. The year was 1878, and Prosperity was living up to its name for everyone but her, it seemed. The small mining town nestled in the Rocky Mountains had boomed after silver was discovered, bringing prosperity to many, including her late husband Thomas, whose mining investments had left her comfortably situated but achingly alone in their 2-story home at the edge of town. Josephine sighed as she lowered herself into the wooden rocking chair on her porch, the crisp autumn air biting at her cheeks. Her fingers absently traced the spine of the book in her lap, but her mind wandered elsewhere. At her age, most women were surrounded by children and grandchildren, not sitting alone watching the world go by. Thomas had wanted children desperately, but year after year, her womb remained empty. Now, according to town gossip, she was damaged goods twice over, barren and aging. The distant sound of hoofbeats drew her attention. A lone rider approached from the east, silhouetted against the setting sun. Josephine watched with mild curiosity as the stranger made his way down the main street. New faces weren't uncommon in Prosperity, though most were rough-looking miners or businessmen hoping to profit from the silver boom. This rider was different. As he passed beneath the lamplight near the saloon, she could make out a tall, broad-shouldered figure, his Stetson pulled low over his face. He rode with the easy confidence of a man who'd spent his life in the saddle. A cowboy, not a miner. Josephine was about to return to her book when the stranger unexpectedly turned his horse toward her home. She straightened, smoothing her skirts reflexively as the man approached her gate. "Evening, madam," he called, his voice deep and pleasant. "Might I trouble you for directions?" "I'm looking for the Adler property." Josephine stood, placing her book on the chair. "You found it, sir. I'm Josephine Adler." The man dismounted with fluid grace, removing his hat to reveal thick, dark hair and a face weathered by sun and wind but handsome nonetheless. His eyes, a startling blue against his tanned skin, crinkled at the corners as he smiled. "Nathan Sullivan at your service," he said, offering a slight bow. "I've been sent by James Holloway from Denver. I believe he wrote to inform you of my arrival." Josephine's brow furrowed. "Mr. Holloway?" "Thomas's lawyer." "Yes, madam. I've been hired to manage some of the outlying properties you inherited. Mr. Holloway thought it best to have someone with ranching experience look after the cattle operation near Silver Creek." Realization dawned on Josephine. "The Sullivan Ranch, of course, Mr. Holloway mentioned something about bringing in a manager, but I expected." "Well, someone older." Nathan's smile widened. "I'm 30, Mrs. Adler. Been ranching since I could walk. My father ran cattle in Texas before the war, and I've spent the last 5 years managing the double bar in Wyoming." "I see." Josephine felt suddenly self-conscious under his direct gaze. "You must be tired from your journey." "The hotel, actually," Nathan interrupted. "Mr. Holloway suggested I might stay in the foreman's cabin at your property. It would allow me to begin work immediately." Josephine hesitated. The idea of having a stranger, a man, living on her property seemed improper, even if the cabin was a good quarter-mile from the main house. As if reading her thoughts, Nathan added, "I understand if that arrangement doesn't suit you, Mrs. Adler. The hotel would be just fine. There was something honest in his expression that put her at ease. Besides, the ranch needed attention. Thomas had acquired it as an investment just before his passing, and it had been neglected since. The cabin will be suitable, Mr. Sullivan, she decided, though I'm afraid it's been empty for some time. I've slept under worse conditions than a dusty cabin, madam, he replied with a chuckle. If you could point me in the right direction, I'll get settled and be ready to start at first light. Josephine gave him directions to the cabin and watched as he tipped his hat, remounted his horse, and rode toward the back of her property. Something about his confident posture and kind eyes lingered in her mind as she returned to her rocking chair. For the first time in months, she felt a spark of something other than grief or resignation. It was a dangerous feeling, one she quickly tried to smother. Mr. Sullivan was her employee, nothing more. And despite what he might think of her age, the town had already decided her fate a widow past her prime, destined to live out her days alone. The morning brought clear skies and a crisp breeze that carried the scent of pine from the surrounding mountains. Josephine rose early, as was her habit, and was surprised to see smoke already rising from the chimney of the foreman's cabin in the distance. Mr. Sullivan was an early riser, it seemed. After dressing in a simple blue dress and pinning her chestnut hair into its usual practical bun, Josephine made her way to the kitchen to prepare breakfast. She had just finished setting the coffee to boil when a knock at the back door startled her. Nathan Sullivan stood on her porch, hat in hand, already dressed for work in a flannel shirt, sturdy denim pants, and well-worn boots. "Good morning, Mrs. Adler," he greeted her. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all, Mr. Sullivan. I'm an early riser myself. I wanted to ask about the boundaries of the property and get your thoughts on priorities before I ride out to the ranch." Josephine nodded. "Of course. Would you care for some coffee and breakfast first? It seems the least I can offer after your long journey." A smile spread across his face, warming his blue eyes. "That's mighty kind of you, Mrs. Adler. I won't say no to a hot meal." Josephine busied herself with preparing a simple breakfast of eggs, bacon, and biscuits. As she worked, she became increasingly aware of Nathan's presence at her kitchen table. It had been so long since a man had sat there. Thomas had always preferred to read the newspaper in the dining room, rarely setting foot in what he considered her domain. "How long have you been in prosperity, Mrs. Adler?" Nathan asked, breaking the silence. "Nearly 7 years now," she replied, placing a steaming mug of coffee before him. "My husband brought us here when the silver boom began. He had a nose for opportunity, Thomas did." "I'm sorry for your loss," Nathan said quietly. "Mr. Holloway mentioned it's been 2 years. Josephine nodded, turning back to the stove to hide the emotion that suddenly threatened to surface. "Yes, influenza. It took him quickly. That's a hard way to lose someone." She appreciated that he didn't offer empty platitudes about Thomas being in a better place or how time heals all wounds, just a simple acknowledgement of her loss. "Did you know him?" she asked, curious about how much the lawyer had shared. Nathan shook his head. "No, madam, but Mr. Holloway spoke highly of him, said he was a sharp businessman who cared deeply for his wife." "He was," Josephine confirmed, setting a plate of food before Nathan. She hesitated, then added, "Though I sometimes wonder if he might have been happier with a different wife. One who could have given him children." The words slipped out before she could stop them, and she immediately regretted her candor. It wasn't proper to discuss such personal matters with a virtual stranger. Nathan looked up from his plate, his gaze direct but kind. "Some things aren't meant to be, Mrs. Adler. Doesn't mean a life is any less valuable." His simple words, spoken without pity, struck her deeply. Before she could respond, he continued, "This is delicious, by the way. Been a while since I've had a home-cooked meal this good." "Thank you," she replied, grateful for the change in subject. Now, about the ranch. They spent the next hour discussing the property. Thomas had purchased the Sullivan Ranch named after its previous owner, no relation to Nathan, as an investment. It comprised 500 acres of good grazing land and a small herd of about 200 cattle. The previous foreman had left shortly after Thomas's death, and the ranch had been minimally maintained by a couple of hired hands who, according to Mr. Holloway's letters, were not up to the task of proper management. "It sounds like my first order of business will be assessing the herd and facilities," Nathan said, jotting notes in a small leather-bound notebook. "Then hiring competent hands, with your permission, of course." "I trust your judgment, Mr. Sullivan. That's why Mr. Holloway recommended you." "I appreciate that trust, Mrs. Adler. I won't let you down." He stood, placing his hat back on his head. "I should get started. There's daylight to burn." Josephine walked him to the door. "Will you be needing anything for the cabin? I have some extra linens and kitchenware." "That's kind of you, but I travel light and have what I need. Though I wouldn't say no to another one of your breakfasts sometime," he added with a smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "I'll keep that in mind, Mr. Sullivan." As she watched him mount his horse and ride toward the ranch, Josephine felt an unfamiliar lightness in her chest. It had been a long time since she'd enjoyed simple conversation with someone who didn't look at her with pity or judgment. But she quickly reminded herself not to read too much into his kindness. Nathan Sullivan was her employee, here to do a job, nothing more. And a man his age would certainly have no interest in a widow several years his senior, regardless of what he might say about her cooking. The next 2 weeks passed in a flurry of activity. True to his word, Nathan worked from sunrise to sunset, assessing the ranch operations and beginning the process of restoration. Josephine found herself riding out to the property several times, ostensibly to check on progress, but increasingly because she enjoyed watching Nathan work. He had a natural way with the cattle and horses, moving among them with quiet confidence. He'd hired 3 new hands, experienced cowboys who respected his leadership, and together they were transforming the neglected ranch into a proper operation. On this particular afternoon, Josephine had ridden out with the excuse of bringing lunch for the men. The truth was, she'd spent the morning baking Nathan's favorite apple pie after he'd mentioned in passing that it reminded him of his mother's cooking. As she approached the corral, she saw Nathan breaking a young mustang. The wild horse bucked and snorted, but Nathan stayed firm in the saddle, moving with the animal rather than fighting against it. The other hands watched from the fence, calling encouragement. Josephine dismounted and joined them, the basket containing lunch hanging from her arm. She couldn't help but admire the way Nathan handled the powerful animal, his strength evident in every movement. After a few more minutes, the mustang began to calm, its bucking less violent. Eventually, it stood still, sides heaving as Nathan patted its neck and spoke softly to it. Only then did he notice Josephine standing at the fence. He tipped his hat, a smile spreading across his face. "Mrs. Adler, what brings you out to our dusty corner of your empire?" "I thought you boys might appreciate some lunch," she replied, lifting the basket. A chorus of appreciation rose from the cowboys, who tipped their hats respectfully. Nathan dismounted and handed the reins to one of the hands. "Walk him cool, Jake," he instructed before turning to Josephine. "That's mighty thoughtful of you, Mrs. Adler." "Please call me Josephine," she said impulsively. "Mrs. Adler makes me feel like my mother-in-law." Nathan's smile widened. "Josephine, then, and I insist you call me Nathan. Mr. Sullivan was my father, and I'm certainly not him." They set up lunch on a rough wooden table outside the bunkhouse. The cowboys ate quickly, thanking Josephine profusely for the food before returning to their tasks. Nathan, however, lingered, savoring the pie with obvious enjoyment. "This reminds me so much of home," he said, finishing the last bite. "My mother would bake pies every Sunday after church. The whole house would smell of apples and cinnamon." "Where is home?" Josephine asked, realizing she knew very little about his past. "Originally Texas, though we moved around some after the war. My father fought for the Confederacy," he added, a shadow crossing his face. "He came back changed. Couldn't settle anywhere for long. And your mother passed away 5 years ago, consumption." He was quiet for a moment. "That's when I took the job in Wyoming, needed a fresh start." "I understand that feeling," Josephine said softly. Nathan studied her face. "How are you finding prosperity these days? Any more welcoming than when I arrived?" Josephine sighed. Word had quickly spread about the handsome new ranch manager staying on her property. The gossip had been relentless, with speculation ranging from her employing him out of desperation to improper relations between them. "Mrs. Whittaker actually crossed the street yesterday to avoid speaking to me," she admitted. "And Reverend Potter made a pointed sermon about maintaining appearances of propriety." Nathan frowned. "That's not right. You've done nothing wrong." "Small towns have long memories and active imaginations, Nathan. They've already decided what kind of woman I am." "And what kind is that?" he asked, his blue eyes intent on her face. Josephine looked away. "A barren widow past her prime who should fade into the background gracefully instead of employing handsome young men." Nathan's laugh surprised her. "Is that what they think? That you hired me for my looks?" Despite herself, Josephine smiled. "You must admit it does look unusual, a widow living alone with a younger man staying on her property." "You know what I think?" Nathan leaned forward, his expression serious now. "I think they're jealous." "Jealous of what?" "Of you. You're independent, intelligent, and managing your affairs successfully without needing a man to make decisions for you. That frightens people in a town like this." Josephine felt warmth spread through her chest at his words. "That's a kind interpretation. It's the truth as I see it." He hesitated, then added, "And as for being past your prime, that's the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard." Their eyes met, and something passed between them, a current of understanding that made Josephine's heart beat faster. But before she could respond, one of the hands called for Nathan's help with a stuck gate. "Duty calls," he said, standing reluctantly. "Thank you for lunch, Josephine, especially the pie." "You're welcome," she replied, gathering the remains of their meal. "Perhaps you'd like to join me for dinner at the house sometime, as a proper thank you for all your hard work." The invitation surprised even her. It was bold, perhaps too bold, but the words were already spoken. Nathan's face lit up. "I'd like that very much. Tomorrow evening." Josephine nodded, trying to ignore the flutter in her stomach. Tomorrow evening. As she rode home, her mind raced with thoughts of what she'd just done. Inviting Nathan to dine alone with her would only fuel the town gossip. But for the first time in years, she found herself not caring what others thought. There was something about Nathan Sullivan that made her feel alive again, and that feeling was too precious to surrender to small-minded talk. The next day passed in a blur of nervous preparation. Josephine spent the morning cleaning the already tidy house, then the afternoon cooking. She prepared Thomas's favorite meal, roast beef with potatoes and carrots, fresh bread, and blackberry cobbler for dessert before catching herself. This dinner wasn't for Thomas. It was for Nathan, and she had no idea what he might prefer. Too late to change the menu now, she decided, and continued her preparations. As the hour of his arrival approached, she found herself standing before the mirror in her bedroom, critically examining her reflection. The woman who stared back at her wasn't the young bride who had arrived in prosperity 7 years ago, full of hope and dreams. Lines had formed at the corners of her eyes, and threads of silver now streaked her chestnut hair. But her eyes were still bright, her figure still trim beneath the simple green dress she'd chosen for the evening. Was she foolish to think a man like Nathan might see anything desirable in her? He could have his pick of the young women in town. Why would he look twice at a widow several years his senior? A knock at the door interrupted her self-doubt. Taking a deep breath, Josephine smoothed her dress and went to greet her guest. Nathan stood on her porch, hat in hand, wearing clean clothes and freshly shaved. His hair was still damp from washing, and he'd clearly made an effort to present himself well. In his free hand, he held a small bouquet of wildflowers. "These are for you," he said, offering them with a slightly self-conscious smile. "Not much, I'm afraid, but I spotted them near the creek and thought you might like them." "They're beautiful," Josephine replied, genuinely touched by the gesture. "Please come in." Dinner began somewhat awkwardly, with both of them carefully maintaining the politeness of employer and employee. But as the meal progressed, and they shared a bottle of wine Thomas had been saving for a special occasion, the conversation flowed more freely. Nathan told stories of his life on the range, cattle drives through thunderstorms, encounters with wild animals, and the characters he'd met along the way. Josephine found herself laughing more than she had in years, drawn in by his natural storytelling ability and the twinkle in his eye when he reached a humorous part. In turn, she shared stories of her childhood in Pennsylvania, her journey west with Thomas, and the early days in prosperity when the town was little more than a collection of tents and hastily constructed buildings. "How did you meet your husband?" Nathan asked as they lingered over dessert. "Through my father," Josephine replied. "Thomas was in banking like my father. He came to dinner one night, and 6 months later we were married." "A whirlwind romance," Josephine considered the question. "Not exactly. It was practical. I was 23, considered nearly an old maid already. Thomas was established, respectable, 15 years my senior. My parents approved." "But did you love him?" Nathan asked, then immediately backtracked. "Forgive me, that's too personal a question." "No, it's all right." Josephine took a sip of wine, gathering her thoughts. "I grew to love him in my way. He was kind, generous, a good provider. He never raised his voice or treated me unkindly. Many women have far worse marriages." "But," Nathan prompted gently. "But there was always something missing," she admitted, surprised at her own candor. "A spark, I suppose. And then when I couldn't give him children." She trailed off, the old pain surfacing again. Nathan reached across the table, his hand covering hers. "That wasn't your fault, Josephine." "Perhaps not, but it was my burden to bear. Thomas never blamed me outright, but I saw his disappointment each month when, well," she flushed, embarrassed to speak of such intimate matters. "Did you want children?" Nathan asked, his hand still warm on hers. "Yes," she whispered, "very much, but it wasn't to be." A comfortable silence fell between them, broken only by the ticking of the clock on the mantel and the distant call of a night bird. "May I ask you something personal now?" Josephine finally said. "Fair's fair," Nathan replied with a small smile. "Why aren't you married?" "A man like you must have had opportunities." Nathan leaned back in his chair, his expression thoughtful. "I came close once back in Texas. Her name was Rebecca. We grew up together, always assumed we'd marry someday. What happened? The war happened. Then my father's restlessness. We moved away, and letters weren't enough to keep her waiting. She married a hardware store owner in Austin." He shrugged, but Josephine sensed old hurt beneath the casual gesture. "After that, I never seemed to stay in one place long enough to court properly. And to be honest, I never met anyone who made me want to try again. Until recently. The last words hung in the air between them, loaded with meaning. Josephine's heart beat faster as Nathan's eyes held hers, the blue depths sincere and unwavering. "Nathan," she began, uncertain of what she wanted to say. He stood suddenly, moving to the window. "It's getting late. I should go before people have more reason to talk." Disappointment washed over Josephine, though she knew he was being sensible. "Of course. Thank you for coming." Nathan turned back to her, his expression conflicted. "Josephine, I need to say something." She stood as well, nervous energy making it impossible to remain seated. "Yes. These past weeks, working for you, getting to know you, it's been the happiest I've been in a long time." "I've enjoyed it too," she admitted softly. "The thing is," he continued, taking a step toward her, "I find myself thinking about you, not as my employer but as a woman. A beautiful, intelligent woman who deserves more than this town gives her credit for." Josephine's breath caught in her throat. "Nathan, I'm 34 years old. You're 30. People would say, I don't give a damn what people say," he interrupted, closing the distance between them. 4 years is nothing." "It's not just the age," she protested weakly. "I'm a widow, I may never be able to give you children." Nathan's hand came up to cup her cheek, his touch gentle but sure. "Do you think that's all I want from a wife, a breeding mare?" The word wife sent a shock through her system. "I don't know what you want." "I want a partner," he said simply. "Someone to share my life with. Someone who makes me laugh, who challenges me, who sees me for who I am. Someone like you, Josephine." Before she could respond, he leaned down and kissed her. It was a gentle kiss, questioning rather than demanding, giving her every opportunity to pull away. But Josephine found herself responding, her hands coming up to rest on his chest as she kissed him back. When they finally parted, both a little breathless, Nathan rested his forehead against hers. "I know this is sudden. I know there will be talk. But I'm falling in love with you, Josephine Adler, and I needed you to know." Tears pricked at her eyes. "I'm afraid," she whispered. "Of what? Of believing in this, of being hurt again, of what people will say." Nathan brushed a strand of hair from her face. "We can take it slow. Get to know each other properly, and as for what people say—" He smiled, that smile that crinkled the corners of his eyes. "Let them talk. We know the truth." Josephine nodded, her heart full of conflicting emotions, fear, hope, and something that felt dangerously like joy. "I'd like that." He kissed her once more, briefly but tenderly, before reluctantly stepping back. "I should go. But I'll see you tomorrow." "Tomorrow," she agreed. After Nathan left, Josephine stood in her empty parlor, fingers touching her lips where she could still feel the warmth of his kiss. For the first time in years, she allowed herself to imagine a different future than the lonely one she'd resigned herself to. The following weeks brought a gradual but profound change to Josephine's life. Nathan continued his work at the ranch, but now there were lingering glances, brushing of hands, and stolen moments of privacy that grew increasingly precious to both of them. True to his word, Nathan took things slowly, courting her with an old-fashioned respect that touched Josephine deeply. He brought her wildflowers and books he thought she might enjoy. They rode together across the property, picnicked by the creek, and spent long evenings in conversation on her porch, heedless of the curious eyes that sometimes watched from the road. As spring warmed into summer, the townspeople's gossip gradually shifted from scandalized whispers to reluctant acceptance. It helped that Nathan made an effort to become part of the community, attending church with Josephine and offering his assistance when the miller's barn caught fire during a lightning storm. His quiet competence and obvious devotion to Josephine eventually won over even some of her harshest critics. All except Mrs. Whittaker, who made it her personal mission to remind everyone of the inappropriateness of their relationship at every opportunity. The nerve of that woman! Josephine fumed one evening as she and Nathan walked back from a town social. "Did you hear what she said to Reverend Potter? That I've ensnared you with my desperate widow's wiles," Nathan chuckled, his arm secure around her waist. "I believe I also heard her mention something about my being blinded by your fortune and too young to know better." "It's not funny, Nathan," Josephine protested, though she couldn't help smiling at his unruffled attitude. "She's poisoning the whole town against us." "Not the whole town," he corrected. "Mrs. Miller invited us both to Sunday dinner next week, and Mr. Peterson at the bank asked my advice about cattle prices. People are coming around, Josephine." "I suppose," she conceded as they reached her gate. "I just hate that they think you're settling for less, being with me." Nathan stopped, turning to face her in the moonlight. "Is that what you think? That I'm settling?" "Sometimes I wonder," she admitted quietly. "You could have any young woman in town, someone who could give you children, who wouldn't make you the subject of gossip." "Josephine Adler," Nathan said, his voice firm as he took both her hands in his. "When will you believe that I love you for exactly who you are? I don't want any young woman in town, I want you, with your wisdom, your strength, your kindness." He smiled, lifting one hand to trace the lines at the corner of her eye. "Even with these, which I happen to find quite beautiful." Josephine felt tears welling up. "Nathan, let me finish," he said gently. "I've been waiting for the right moment, but maybe there isn't one. Maybe now is as good a time as any." To her astonishment, he dropped to one knee before her, still holding her hands. From his pocket, he produced a small velvet box. "Josephine Adler, these past months have been the happiest of my life. You've shown me what it means to truly love someone, not because it's practical or expected, but because your heart recognizes its match." He opened the box, revealing a simple but elegant ring with a small sapphire. "Will you do me the great honor of becoming my wife?" Josephine stared at the ring, then at Nathan's earnest face, illuminated by moonlight. In his eyes, she saw not just love, but something she'd never expected to find again, a future filled with possibility. "People will talk," she whispered, one last token resistance. Nathan grinned. "Let them. I'll be too busy loving my wife to notice." A laugh bubbled up from deep inside her, pure joy breaking free after years of restraint. "Yes," she said, pulling him to his feet. "Yes, Nathan Sullivan, I will marry you." He slipped the ring onto her finger, then lifted her off her feet in a joyful embrace that made her laugh again. When he set her down, his kiss was tender yet passionate, a promise of the life they would build together. "I love you," she whispered against his lips, "more than I thought possible." "And I love you," he replied, "age and all." Their wedding took place that autumn, a small ceremony in the town church with surprisingly many well-wishers in attendance. Even Mrs. Whittaker made an appearance, though she sat in the back and left immediately after the vows were exchanged. As they emerged from the church as husband and wife, showered with flower petals and congratulations, Nathan leaned down to whisper in Josephine's ear. "Happy, Mrs. Sullivan. Happier than I ever imagined," she replied truthfully, squeezing his hand. That evening, as they stood on the porch of what was now their home, watching the sunset paint the mountains gold, Josephine felt a deep sense of peace settle over her. "What are you thinking?" Nathan asked, his arms encircling her from behind. "I'm thinking about how wrong everyone was," she replied. "Including me. I thought my life was over after Thomas died, that I was too old for love, too damaged for happiness." Nathan turned her in his arms to face him. "And now?" Josephine smiled, tracing the beloved contours of his face with her fingertips. "Now I know better. Love doesn't have an expiration date, and happiness can find you when you least expect it." "Wise words, Mrs. Sullivan," he murmured, bending to kiss her. "I've had some time to learn them," she teased, then grew serious. "Thank you for seeing me when I thought I was invisible, for loving me when I'd forgotten how to love myself. Always," he promised, "for all the days we have." As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Josephine and Nathan Sullivan stood wrapped in each other's arms, no longer concerned with what anyone else might think or say. They had found in each other something rare and precious, a love that defied expectations and healed old wounds, proving that it's never too late for a new beginning. And in the years that followed, as they built their life together, and the Sullivan Ranch prospered under their joint care, the townspeople of Prosperity gradually forgot to be scandalized by their unconventional romance. Instead, they came to see what Nathan had recognized from the start, that love knows no proper age, and that a heart's capacity for joy doesn't diminish with the passing years, but only grows stronger when it finds its perfect match.